A reservoir in Texas is almost empty, and 500,000 people depend on it to survive. This isn't an exaggeration. This isn't a projection for 10 years from now. This is happening right now. In April 2026, in one of the largest cities in the most populous state in the American South, Lake Corpus Christi has hit its lowest level since it was built in 1958. Choke Canyon Reservoir, the city's second primary water source, dropped from 47% to less than 8% capacity in just 4 years. Combined, both reservoirs are now below 8%. And this week, an internal 43-page document obtained by American journalists revealed that the city officially projects a level 1 water emergency for September 2026. September, 5 months from now. But Corpus Christi isn't the only problem. It's just the most visible one. From the Rio Grande Valley to the Austin Hill Country, from the Edwards Aquifer in San Antonio to the Ogallala Aquifer in the Panhandle. The entire state of Texas is facing a water crisis that has been building for decades and has reached its breaking point while the state kept growing, kept attracting industry, and kept making promises that nature is not going to keep. Governor Greg Abbott has issued emergency orders. A U.S. congressman told the Secretary of Energy during a congressional hearing, "We are running out of water. I just want to remind you of that," the former director of Corpus Christi's water department said publicly. "This is the worst scenario I have ever seen in my life. That is not alarmism. Those are the words of people who have the numbers in front of them." This video is going to show you how Texas got here, who is consuming the water that is running out, and why the solution that could have prevented all of this was cancelled 7 months ago because it got too expensive. Let me give you a number that sounds impossible for a city of 500,000 people: 8%. That is the combined capacity of the two reservoirs that supply 95% of Corpus Christi's water. Not a backup source, not a secondary system, the main supply. The water that comes out of the tap when a resident turns it on. The water that cools the towers of refineries processing crude oil. The water that keeps one of the largest petrochemical corridors in the United States running every single day. 8%. To understand how serious that is, consider this: water restrictions in Corpus Christi began in December 2024, when the combined capacity hit 20%. At that point, residents were already banned from watering their lawns. The city was already under Stage 3 drought restrictions. That was considered a crisis worth announcing publicly. Since then, the reservoirs have lost more than half of what they had left. Choke Canyon Reservoir went from 47% full in October 2021 to less than 8% full in April 2026. That 4-year decline is not the result of one bad drought year. It is the accumulated result of 5 consecutive years of rainfall running at less than 60% of normal across South Texas. Year after year after year, the rivers that feed these reservoirs, the Nueces and the Frio, brought less water than the city consumed. And the gap between what came in and what went out kept widening. Lake Corpus Christi is now at its lowest level since the reservoir was created in 1958. Think about what that means. In nearly 70 years of recorded history, including every drought, every dry season, every heat wave the region has faced, the lake has never been this low. Not once. NASA published satellite images earlier this year comparing both reservoirs in October 2021 and October 2025. The difference is not subtle. Where there was water, there is now cracked earth and exposed lake bed. The visual is the kind of image that makes the data feel real in a way that percentages alone cannot, and the data keeps getting worse. As of this week, the combined capacity of the two reservoirs has dropped to 7.8%. There is a third source, Lake Texana, located about 100 miles to the northeast, currently sitting at roughly 50% capacity. But Lake Texana was never designed to be Corpus Christi's primary supply. It is an emergency buffer. And under normal drought management rules, the city would already be required to cut its withdrawals from Lake Texana once it drops below 50%. Governor Abbott intervened in March, lowering that threshold to 40% to buy the city more time. But water experts project Lake Texana could fall to 30% by summer as heat increases evaporation rates. Every measure being taken right now buys months, not years, months. The city is drilling emergency well fields, clusters of groundwater wells designed to pump tens of millions of gallons per day into the Nueces River to supplement reservoir levels. One of those well fields hit technical setbacks in recent weeks that reduced its expected output. That single setback was enough to move the projected water emergency from November to September in the city's internal models. That is how thin the margin is. Here is what I want you to carry into the next part of this video. This reservoir did not reach 8% capacity overnight. It took 5 years of drought to drain it to this level. But it also took something else, something that had nothing to do with rainfall, to make sure there was nothing left when the drought arrived. That something is what the next block is about. Corpus Christi knew this was coming, not as a vague possibility, as a documented, projected, peer-reviewed certainty. Water engineers warned the city, as far back as 2015, that industrial growth combined with prolonged drought would outpace reservoir capacity. The solution had a name, a location, and a price tag: a desalination plant that would convert seawater into usable water, making the city independent of rainfall for a significant portion of its supply. The original estimate was $160 million. Over years of debate, political turnover, and competing interests, that number climbed to $1.3 billion. And in September 2025, 4 years into the drought, with reservoirs already falling, the Corpus Christi City Council voted 6-3 to cancel the project. 7 months later, the city is projecting a water emergency for September 2026. While the desalination project was being debated and delayed, the city kept making promises. Since 2015, petrochemical plants, a steel mill, and liquefied natural gas facilities arrived with contracts guaranteeing tens of millions of gallons of water per day. Gulf Coast Growth Ventures, a joint venture between ExxonMobil and Saudi company SABIC, opened in 2022 and alone consumes 25 million gallons per day, the same volume as every single resident of the city combined. Industry as a whole accounts for 50 to 60% of all water consumption in the region. And here is the detail that changes everything. 10 of the largest industrial users have permanent exemptions from emergency restrictions. They paid a surcharge years ago, 31 cents per 1,000 gallons, and bought themselves permanent immunity. Even during a level 1 water emergency, they cannot be forced to cut consumption. So when mandatory cuts come, they will fall on residents and smaller businesses. The companies that consume the most water are legally protected from being asked to use less. It's going to be an economic disaster, said the former director of Corpus Christi's water department. The worst scenario I have ever seen. He was not speaking about the drought. He was speaking about the decisions made while the drought was already underway. The Texas Observer published a piece this week with a title that says everything. The Corpus Christi water crisis isn't exceptional. It's early, not isolated, not unique, early. The Rio Grande Valley, in far South Texas, has its major reservoirs below 25% capacity. Brownsville banned car washing and drained public pools. The city of Mission considered a moratorium on new construction. And the situation is complicated further by Mexico, which is significantly behind on water releases guaranteed by a 1944 international treaty, because Mexico is facing its own water crisis and has nothing to spare. In central Texas, the Edwards Aquifer, the primary water source for San Antonio and surrounding hill country communities, dropped to its second lowest level since the 1930s at the start of this year. In May 2025, it hit its lowest point since the 1950s, forcing regulators to cut permitted pumping by nearly half. Rivers in the hill country were at their lowest levels since record-keeping began over 100 years ago. In the Panhandle and West Texas, the Ogallala Aquifer, which took 6 to 8 million years to form, is being drained faster than it can recover. Texas pulls more water from the Ogallala than any other state. And unlike surface reservoirs, when an aquifer runs dry, there is no emergency order that brings it back. The Texas Water Development Board calculated that without action, Texas could face a shortage of nearly 7 million acre-feet per year by 2070 under severe drought conditions. That would leave roughly a quarter of the state's population without enough water, with projected economic damages of $150 billion. Voters approved a $20 billion water infrastructure package in 2025. It sounds like a serious response. But the cost of implementing the state water plan in North Texas alone grew by $20 billion compared to the plan from 5 years earlier. The problem is growing faster than the money chasing it. And here is what connects every single one of these situations. From Corpus Christi to San Antonio to the Rio Grande Valley to the Panhandle, the pattern is identical. Decades of growth built on water availability projections that assumed conditions which no longer exist. Infrastructure decisions deferred until the window to act closed. And a drought that did not create the crisis, it simply exposed how fragile the system already was. Here is what September 2026 looks like if nothing changes. Corpus Christi enters a Level 1 water emergency. Mandatory 25% cuts across all users. Residents, businesses, smaller industrial operations, all forced to reduce consumption immediately. The 10 largest industrial users, legally exempt, keep running at full capacity. The burden falls on everyone else. If the reservoirs keep dropping and the cuts aren't enough, the city moves to Level 2, 50% reduction across the board. At that point, refineries that cannot throttle down face a choice between shutting off their cooling towers, risking explosions, or shutting down entirely. The former director of Corpus Christi's water department described that scenario in one sentence: controlled depression, mass unemployment, industrial total shutdown. Those are not the words of an activist. That is a water professional describing what the numbers lead to. Now think about what that means beyond Corpus Christi. The port of Corpus Christi is the largest crude oil export hub in the United States. The refineries in that city produce jet fuel for Texas airports. Petrochemical plants there supply materials that feed supply chains across the country. When a congressional representative told the Secretary of Energy, "We are running out of water," during a federal budget hearing, and the Secretary responded by promising permitting reform without addressing the timeline, that exchange happened because people in Washington understand what is at stake. The desalination plant is back on the table. A new contractor submitted a proposal. The city will vote. But even if approved today, it will not be operational before 2028. The crisis is measured in months. The solution is measured in years. Emergency well fields are being drilled. Governor Abbott has issued emergency orders. The state approved $20 billion for water infrastructure. These are real responses. But they are responses to a problem that was documented, projected, and published for over a decade, and consistently met with delay, political disagreement, and deferred cost. Stop and think about that for a moment. The science was right. The warnings were issued. The engineers knew. The projections were published, and the decision made in September 2025 to cancel the one project that could have changed the timeline was made by people who had access to every single piece of that information. This is not a story about drought. Droughts happen. This is a story about what happens when a system is built for conditions that no longer exist, and the people responsible for updating that system chose not to, until the reservoirs hit 8% and the clock ran out. Texas is the fastest growing state in America. It is adding hundreds of thousands of new residents every year. It is attracting data centers, semiconductor factories, petrochemical plants, and steel mills with promises of abundant resources. And underneath all of that growth is a water system that the state's own planning documents describe as inadequate for the demand already placed on it, let alone the demand being invited in. Corpus Christi is not the end of this story. It is the beginning. I want to leave you with one question. Everything you just watched, the 5-year drought, the canceled desalination plant, the industrial exemptions, the reservoirs at 8%, the emergency projected for September, none of it was hidden. It was all documented, published, and available to anyone who looked. So here is what I want you to think about and answer in the comments. If the data was there, the warnings were issued, and the decision was still made to cancel the solution 7 months before the emergency, what exactly are we waiting for in the other Texas cities facing the same trajectory? In the Rio Grande Valley, in San Antonio, in the Panhandle? And more importantly, is your city next? Because Corpus Christi is not a Texas problem. It is a preview. The same pattern of growth outpacing water supply, infrastructure decisions deferred, and drought exposing the gap. That pattern exists in Arizona, in Nevada, in New Mexico, in parts of California. The geography changes. The story doesn't. Drop your answer below. And if you live in Texas or anywhere in the American West, tell me what the water situation looks like where you are right now. Because the people closest to this crisis are often the last ones whose voices get heard.